switch back and forth between these kind of spots just to show some pictures. So my name's Jaime. I'm a PhD candidate at UW-Madison. I also am an aviation photographer, so I do it for fun. I've been doing this for roughly started around the pandemic time. Yeah, I've been fortunate to be able to do it for the last couple of years now. And now getting ready to actually the next week head up back to Oshkosh for the big air show up there. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the pictures that I've taken throughout the years, a little bit about the stories about the planes, and then so on and so forth. So this particular picture, so this one, I'll start with this one. This is one of my favorites. So this is a Delta, I believe it's a 757, something like that. And this plane was actually, just happened to be lucky. I noticed it was a full moon, thankfully. It was a full moon. I've been trying to get a picture of a plane in front of the moon for years now. And it just so happened that I was like, okay, my apartment faces directly east. So whenever planes are flying east-west, every once in a while I'll get lucky that they'll pass right in front of the moon. And this happened to be one of those few times. And by pure chance, I ended up posting this on social media. One thing led to another, and I was able to get the picture of the pilot who was actually flying. And it was actually one of his first few times that he was flying that particular plane. So it was really cool to be able to share that with him. Now, so this one is also a really fun picture. So this one is known as the Astrojet. So American Airlines, I'm wearing my American Airlines shirt today. So American Airlines has several planes where essentially what they do is they paint them in a special livery. So essentially, throughout the years, American Airlines and several other airlines have acquired smaller airlines and things like that. Well, American Airlines sort of pays tribute to those. For example, there's a Piedmont airline. There used to be TWA. There used to be or Transworld Airlines. There used to be Cal Air, things like that. So American Airlines is one of the few airlines that actually almost pays tribute to those airlines. This one in particular is not necessarily paying tribute to an old airline, but it's paying tribute to one of their first jets. So when the jet era came around, American Airlines had or advertised their planes known as Astrojets. And so what they did is they basically took off all the paint off this new modern plane, I should say, and gave it the old look of American Airlines with the old American Airlines logo and painted it with Astrojet. And this is actually a really cool plane for me. This was one that I traveled a very long distance for, so I went down to Chicago specifically for this one. Thankfully, there were other planes, obviously, thankfully outside of O'Hare. But it was fun to be able to get this one. So, actually, I'm going to switch programs real quick because it seems like this one is not showing properly. So just give me a quick second. Oh, yeah. There we go. Okay, now it's a little bit bigger. There we go. And this is one of the other liveries that I mentioned. So this is a Piedmont Airlines, which at one point was based out of, I want to say Pennsylvania. Very well could be wrong, but yeah, Piedmont Airlines was another airline. American Airlines decided to paint this A319 in one of their special paint schemes, keeping the current American Airlines logo. Let's see. Whoops. Oh boy, just a bunch. All right, there. All right, so as you can tell, I'm probably a big fan of American Airlines. American Airlines. So this is another one of those special liveries or special paint schemes, I should say. So essentially, with this one, what they did is this is managed by American Airlines and their Veterans Affairs. But essentially, in this case, what they did is they painted this plane with the Medal of Honors, or the Medals of Honor, I should say, from the different branches of the military. And then this is a plane that's often used as tribute to veterans. What's particularly cool about this plane is that this particular picture I happen to get it out, most of the pictures that I take are here at Madison Airport. But this plane in particular, and this picture in particular, actually ended up being used by American Airlines for some of their advertisement and basically cards that they would give away to passengers who were flying on this particular plane. This particular plane is often used if you're familiar with honor flights. So here locally we have the Badger Honor Flight that happens once or twice every season. This happened to be one of those Badger Honor flights. So that was a big honor for me to be able to share that picture with them. I am also a very big fan of the 747s. So this is an Atlas Air 747. If you're not familiar with Atlas Air, basically it's a cargo company. So almost like FedEx, UPS, DHL, things like that. But what Atlas Air is more specific is to broader or larger customers, I should say. So it's not like, oh, I can just drop it off at Atlas Air and they'll ship it off. So for example, they could be contracted out to FedEx could decide to hire one of these planes for a little bit, or UPS could do that, or I know that Atlas Air was used, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, it might have been 2017 actually, when the Badgers were going to the Rose Bowl. So Atlas Air actually operates some that are passenger airplanes, and they brought in a 747 to take, it was either the alumni or the band out to Pasadena for the Rose Bowl way back when. Going on into a little bit more of the smaller planes. So this is a Dassault Falcon 9X. Now what's particularly cool about this picture is what you can see, so one, it's a 3-engine plane. I am a big fan of 3-engine planes. There's something just really cool and special about them. But what's particularly cool about this picture for me is that this was taken out in the California desert. So the background that you're seeing is actually the Mojave Desert out in California. There's an area out in California where they're known as the Star Wars Canyon, essentially, where what planes do, and used to do for the most part, now its activity there has decreased a little bit, is they'll dive into this canyon and then basically looks like almost like if they're flying through canyons in Star Wars or something along those lines. So they'll fly through this canyon at low altitudes. In fact, this plane, maybe 20 seconds after I took this picture, started diving down, and I was watching it from below, or I'm sorry, I was watching it below me as it was flying across. So that was a really cool experience to be able to see that. This is I'm also, so again, sticking with the small planes. I'm a big fan of any planes that are related to science. I am a scientist, so any planes that are related to scientists are pretty fun for me. So this is a NOAA plane, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Yeah, pretty sure it's administration. But yeah, so this is a NOAA plane. Basically, what these type of planes do, and this is they travel around the country, do different types of missions, whether it be making measurements over the ocean, or making measurements over land, or taking samples from our atmosphere. For this particular mission, or when this particular picture was taken, this plane was flying around the Midwest. Measuring snow levels, or the lack of snow levels, because it happened to be a time when we had just had a recent melt. So that's what was going on with this particular picture. I also like to do formation photography, so I tend to travel to air shows frequently. You heard me mention Oshkosh, so I'll be traveling to Oshkosh next week. Be there likely all weekend. Hopefully it stays at a decent temperature and doesn't, we don't have a big rainstorm like we had the last couple of weeks. But with this one, so this is the full throttle formation team. This picture was actually taken over Dubuque, Iowa. And what's cool about these particular planes is these are known as Vans RV-8s. So basically, these are planes that people can order, and they build them at home or at their local airport if they have a hangar or something along those lines. So all these planes are home built. Several of the pilots have served in the military. Several have served in the military, or are airline pilots, or are flight instructors, or things like that. The person that I connected with, or actually the way that I connected with this group, is the year before this picture was taken, I was at Dubuque again. And like any other time, if you talk to someone at Madison Airport, they'll tell you, oh, there's a guy in a gray Nissan Altima who's always parked outside of the fence, and that's going to be me. This happened to be the same case, except at Dubuque Airport. So I was outside of Dubuque Airport, taking pictures through the fence of some planes that were right there, and I saw a couple of guys leaving. And I was like, oh, better get in my car, because then, I'm going to get a ticket or something like that. Well, it turns out it was some of the pilots for this group. I was able to send them pictures. We exchanged contact information. They were back in the Midwest like 3 weeks later because they're based out of Georgia. And they invited me to go down to Illinois and be their photographer. And I've been their photographer when they're in the Midwest for the last 2 or 3 years, which has been a really cool opportunity to be able to work with them and see what kind of planes what kind of pictures and what kind of angles they want. So. This one was taken a couple months back. Ooh, not that one. This one was taken a couple months back. So this is a Bell Ranger helicopter. What's pretty cool about this one, so this was actually on my way back from Missouri for the eclipse. So I was driving back on my way to Missouri. Of course, I had just spent, hours watching an eclipse because I'm also really interested in astrophotography. I was just here last week showing my eclipse pictures. But on my way back, after just having crossed back into Illinois from Missouri, I saw a helicopter off in the distance just kind of doing like all these really weird movements. I was like, what the heck is going on? Kept driving, and sure enough, this guy was just flying, dropping whatever it is dropping on all these crops. And going pretty fast and almost in an acrobatic kind of fashion. So that was really cool to be able to see that. And I've been trying to share this picture with that company. I just haven't been able to get in touch with them just yet. But I always travel with my camera, regardless if I'm planning on taking pictures or not. Like I mentioned, I do enjoy a lot of aerobatic performances or demonstration performances. So this is a Lucas Oil biplane. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's definitely not a steer, but it's a biplane. And what's cool about this guy is I was almost exactly at eye level with him. What you're seeing down here, the water down here, is actually the Mississippi River between Dubuque and whatever that small city is on the Wisconsin side. This was at that same Dubuque Air Show. And one of the things that you may notice in some of these pictures, at least the ones with the rotors, is this blur. So one of the things that I and a lot of photographers really enjoy doing is, and it's very much an acquired skill, is being able to get that prop blur, because otherwise all the propeller is just standing still, and it almost looks like, oh, it's just like a toy. But when you're getting the blur, you're getting a little bit more of that action shot. Eventually, for example, like Oshkosh next week, I know that I'll be there starting Tuesday. Starting around Friday or Saturday, it's going to be, okay, who can get the slowest? And the reason why it's such a fun challenge is because if, let's say, you're taking a picture and let's say I have it set to 1/1000th for my shutter speed. That's really quick. So in that case, that propeller would be essentially frozen. If I drop it down, I usually drop it down to 1/125th. That's a lot slower. If I move a little bit, there might be a little bit of blur, like as in the picture won't be focused, but odds are that'll be fine. Then you start dropping down to 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/10th of a second, which is very, very slow. And then once you start getting into that area, you have to be very, very steady to be able to get certain blurs, which is usually the amount of speed that you have to be at to be able to get blur for example, for helicopters, because the larger the propeller or the larger the rotor, whatever it may be, whether it be a helicopter rotor or like a large propeller, you have to be able to slow it down a lot more just because it spins a lot faster. This is one of the weirder planes that I've taken a picture of. So one of the weirder, but definitely one of my unicorns. So this is the NASA Super Guppy. The Super Guppy was introduced, I want to say it was in the early 60s, late 70s, I believe. Essentially what it was used for is it's kind of what it looks like. I mean, you've got the cockpit right here, but everything else is empty. It's essentially used to take cargo to different places. For the most part, it was originally used to carry around pieces of the shuttle, whether it was being built in California and taken over to Florida or something along those lines. Now it's mostly used for the Artemis program, and occasionally, one story that I've heard is it's used to pick up planes that break down in other places. So this was at Oshkosh. NASA also flies what are known as T-38s. This is not a NASA T-38, this is a US Air Force T-38, a picture that I took of here in Madison. But NASA T-38 broke down out off the California coast, and I know about this because I know photographers out there. Broke down over there. Basically that cover shield, or the cover went away as they were taking off, fell somewhere in the ocean. They came in to land and they couldn't fly it. So they brought in that Super Guppy, loaded it up, and then took it back to Houston in that case to be able to repair it. In this case, so the T-38 is a trainer model, so that's what the T stands for. So it's a trainer model where any pilot in the Air Force, and a couple of the other branches of the military as well, but primarily the Air Force uses this to train, get hours, get accustomed to being able to fly. Usually all the T-38s have two pilots in them, or I'm sorry, have two cockpits in them, one of them being the student, the other one being the instructor as they're going along and learning. So one of the things that I do the most is military photography. This is an F-16. I've been fortunate to be able to capture almost every model of the U.S. military's, in the U.S. military's arsenal. So this is the F-16. This is an F-16 that is based out of Arizona for the Air National Guard out there. But here in Wisconsin, we have an area known as Volk Field and Hardwood Range. So Volk Field is up north. It's up by Camp Douglas. What the military does, primarily the National Guard, they'll bring in people from the Navy, they'll bring in people from the Marines as well. Basically what they do is they'll be up there, and for 2 weeks in August they'll be training, simulating dogfighting missions, simulating dropping bombs on certain ranges and things like that. This happened to be a really special occasion because, as you can tell, that picture is very close. It's not cropped all that much. Essentially, I was about from here to where that wall is while this plane was taking off. So I was very lucky to be able to get out on that field. Thankfully, through connections of almost pestering people, being like, "Hey, I want to take a picture of this. Hey, I want to take a picture of this." And sure enough, I was able to stand out there about 20 feet away as these planes were taking off. Definitely with hearing protection, except I did get a little crazy at one point. I was like, I'm just gonna pop one out real quick, just see what happens. And it was a bad choice, but I figured why not? May as well try it. So this is another really cool plane. As you'll see, it has these really special markings. So this is an F-18 Legacy Hornet. So the reason why it's called Legacy Hornet is it's one of the older versions of it. I'll show you the newest version of it shortly. But these Legacy Hornets are the older versions of it. If you've watched, let's say, for example, Independence Day, those are the F-18s that they used in that movie. But the reason why this particular one is so special, besides it being a Legacy Hornet, because it's barely used anymore. It's mostly used by training squadrons, and it has this really distinct kind of howl as it's flying around. But what's cool is you can see that paint. So this particular plane belongs to a squadron known as the Aggressors. So essentially what they do is, you can see this, in this case, it's a Russian paint scheme, or what the Russians would, the common camo that Russians would use. Excuse me. And essentially what they do is they train on the red team. So you've got the blue team that are training to dogfight with them and being able to identify them and work and basically simulate dogfighting and attacks and things like that, where these guys are on the red team. So they're flying around as well when they're up in training missions, essentially trying to outmaneuver the blue team. What's really cool about this, and I wish I had put the picture up here, but what's cool about this is on most planes, the pilot who usually uses it, there's a couple different reasons why their names are put on there, but their names are on there. and their names were actually in Russian, which is actually really cool. American pilots, but their names were in Russian. So like I mentioned, this is a Legacy Hornet. This is a Super Hornet. So these are the U.S. Navy Blue Angels, probably one of the most iconic demonstration teams in the world. One of the reasons why, so the Legacy Hornet, like I said, is older. The Super Hornet is much newer, faster, a little bit bigger, and definitely a lot louder, which is pretty cool. This picture I took this was over La Crosse. So this was at the La Crosse Air Show about 4 or 5 years ago. And just one of the really cool things with the Blue Angels, and I would strongly recommend if you have Prime to watch the Blue Angel documentary that just came out a couple of months ago. It's an excellent documentary. What's really cool about them is just how close they fly. Sometimes these pilots are flying, 6 inches to a foot away from each other. Very, very close. So it's a lot of months of training and months of being able to perfect being able to fly that close together. And actually, one of the pilots that's on the Blue Angels now, so pilot number 5, I forget his name, but his call sign is Push Pop. He's actually from Madison. He went to West High School. So we've got a local person who's on the Blue Angels right now. This is another Blue Angels picture. This might be one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken. So this was not over La Crosse. This was over Long Beach, California. So I'm originally from California, so I'll travel back and forth here and there. I've been known to travel to very different places for air shows or demonstrations. In this case, someone was getting a joyride. The Blue Angels and the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds. What they'll do is they'll have people nominate from other people from around the country. Like let's say here in La Crosse, they nominated people from the La Crosse community to be able to get a ride. Usually it's people who've made a big impact in the community or things like that. In this particular case, was a professor at a local community college, a professor of engineering, if I remember correctly, at the local community college. And he went up, got to take a joyride, they took him up, and basically they put you to your limit. They go up to 9 Gs, roughly, and then most of the time people pass out because it's just like all the blood is flowing to your legs. But in this particular case, I think he stayed conscious. But this is one of my favorite pictures of just being able to get the smoke going away and the vapor and all that stuff. So it's pretty fun. So this is another really cool picture for me, also out in the California desert. This was actually the first time I was out in the desert. It's funny, I moved here to Wisconsin when I was 24. I'm now almost 30. Never even thought about going out to the desert to do photography or anything like that. And then once I moved here, that's when I started learning, oh man, there's all these cool places out there to take pictures. So anytime I get home, I usually spend 2 days out in the desert. In this case, same thing. This is also an F-18 Super Hornet. And out in the desert, and I had just parked. I was getting out, and this is in that same area known as Star Wars Canyon that I had mentioned. It's essentially a loop that they go around the California desert to train. Well, there's one particular spot where a lot of photographers go. This is my first time going. I had just pulled up, and you could get 10 planes in a day, sit out there for 8 hours and you get 10 planes that pass by. You could sit out there for 8 hours and get 1 plane. You could sit out there for 8 hours and get nothing. So it definitely has to be something where like, all right, I'm gonna go out there and I'm just gonna see if I can get something. Well, sure enough, I had just parked, and as I parked, something flew by super quick right over me with full afterburner. And I had gotten out of my car and I was like, oh my God. And I didn't get a picture of it, but then like I just looked and I was like, what is that off in the distance? And sure enough, I was able to, it was this guy. So I was able to get just this really cool picture, painted with the Sierra Nevadas in the background. So it's also one of my favorite pictures. So the U.S. Air Force also, and several other allies use the C-17, this extremely large aircraft that we actually get to see pretty frequently here in Madison. It was most recently here was that 4th of July, bringing President Biden's motorcade and some other, and the helicopter, Marine One as well. But the C-17 is a workhorse of the U.S. Air Force and of various allies. It's a cargo aircraft, and it's amazing. I was lucky enough to be able to see the last one that was ever produced, that was delivered to Egypt, because this was built in Long Beach, California. So, or the C-17 program was based out of Long Beach, California. So I was able to see the very last one take off and fly. This one, I believe, is over Oshkosh. One of the cool things that they'll do is they'll fly really low. They'll come in, land super quickly, and then they'll just start taxiing back, which most planes can do, where essentially they're pushing the engines in reverse to help push them back, and then push it back enough to be able to take off again. So that was a really fun experience. This is an F-15 Eagle, basically the workhorse of Desert Storm, and still very much probably one of the most useful planes in the Air Force's arsenal. This particular picture was over Madison as well, where in this case, unfortunately, the local 115 fighter wing had a pilot who crashed back in, I want to say it was December 2018, December 2019. And his brother happened to be a pilot for the F-15s out in Oregon. Oregon. And so they did a flyover here in Madison, and his brother came and was able to head that missing man flyover while they were doing a celebration of life for him. But yeah, the F-15 Eagle, amazing plane. Unfortunately, we don't get to see them all that often around here, but it is a cool plane. So you might have heard me say that, or you might remember me saying, having to increase the shutter speed or slow down the shutter speed. The A-10, which most people say is essentially a plane built around a gun, because that's literally what it is. It's got this huge gun that fires, bullets that are about that long, probably about that thick. So it's huge. But what's really cool about the A-10 is it's a tank destroyer. It's what, if you're out on the battlefield and you see someone coming towards you, you want this guy. But what's cool about this particular one is it's got, the Air Force also does those special paint schemes. This happens to be one from Maryland, so it's got the Oriole on the back, or on the engine. And in this case, this is one of those situations where you really want that shutter speed to be really fast, because you can get a bullet as it's coming out. I didn't happen to get it in this one, or if I might, it might just not be able to be visible on the projector. But this is one of those situations where you want that really fast shutter speed to be able to get that bullet as it's going by. So it's really fun to be able to do this. And this was over Hardwood Range, out in north of Camp Douglas. This was also over Hardwood Range, north of Camp Douglas. You'll see that I'm over the tree line. This was one of those situations where I got really lucky, happened to know the right person, and I went out to Hardwood Range, and they said, "Oh, we're going to take you up to the tower." So went up about 3 or 4 stories, and these guys were flying at eye level with us, and they would do very close passes. Maybe from here to roughly outside, they would fire that gun, and it's a very distinct brr, brr, that you would hear, and it's loud. But yeah, it's really cool to be able to get into different angles, and as opposed to just looking at something from the ground, being almost at eye level with these guys. This is another one of my unicorns right here. This is also kind of the workhorse of Desert Storm, and actually a little bit earlier. So this is the F-117 Nighthawk. This is the first stealth plane that ever existed. It just looks really weird, and that's the reason for its stealth. So essentially, the way it works is that any radar that is trying to detect it can't necessarily find it, or actually, I should say, it does have what's known as a radar cross section, which means on the radar it looks like a certain size. Well, this plane is huge, but on radar it looks roughly like if it was the size of a hummingbird. So the enemy radar can't necessarily pick it up. And that's one of the reasons, or that's the main reason why it's got all of these different kind of like geometrical, flat surfaces, is to be able to bounce that radar off and also is coated in this special black paint that it basically absorbs any remaining radar. This is, like I said, this is one of my unicorns. I got this picture last year, drove up to Duluth, because they were based out of Duluth during that exercise that I had mentioned that occurs over Hardwood Range. They were based out of Duluth, essentially acting like if they were missiles that were being fired. Officially, this plane has been retired by the US Air Force, but the Air Force has acknowledged that it is still active in training purposes. What that training is, don't know, but. This is a Harrier, so this is another one really cool plane. I like to say it's almost like a helicopter because it actually is really much like a helicopter. So what's cool about this with the Harrier and a couple of other types of planes is that they're able to take off vertically. So in other words, instead of, let's say you're out at sea, because it's mostly used by Marines, let's say you're out at sea or something along those lines, you can't take off as if you were on an aircraft carrier for whatever reason. This guy is able to take off vertically and then be able to keep going forward. And it's also able to land that same way. So in fact, in this case, it was actually landing. It's known as short takeoff landing. In other words, it doesn't require all that much space. Now I'm going to skip one of these pictures, but I'll come right back to it. This is another one of those planes, or plane helicopter combos, I should say, that is able to take off vertically and then start flying normally like if it was an airplane. So this is V-22 Osprey. You'll notice it's painted in a green color. That's because this belongs to the squadron known as HMX-1, which is essentially the squadron that flies that flies Marine One. So in this particular one was not during this last visit of President Biden, but the second to last visit, which was, I want to say, in April, where he was making a visit both to here and Chicago. This guy came up from Chicago, did something for 20 minutes, and then basically was headed back to Chicago. But this is the kind of plane that is normally used to transport the press corps whenever they're visiting certain areas. In this case, I think they were simply just picking up some stuff for the visit to Madison. Took off vertically, got just maybe about a mile away, and then as it's flying, it starts turning those rotors and it starts flying like a plane because it's a lot faster for them. And then this one, sticking with government planes, I believe this was Vice President Harris's visit a couple of months ago. This is not what the president uses this as well, so this is known as a C-32. It's not so any plane that the president flies on that belongs to the Air Force is Air Force One. Any plane or helicopter that the president flies on that belongs to the Marines is Marine One, so on and so forth. So this plane could be known as Air Force One, not just the 747. In this case, it's Air Force Two because the vice president is flying on it. So Vice President Harris was coming in. This is coming in, landing from the south. And there's a certain place, I've been outside of the airport long enough and many times enough that I'm kind of like, okay, I know where to go, where to get a certain picture. In this case, I decided to go out, get this picture, and I was able to get the Capitol building in the background, which was really cool to people, which sort of show that kind of like federal, state, kind of things going on. So. Try and hurry up. See, it's 12:35 or 1:35. This is a picture that probably almost got me in trouble. So this picture, as you might remember, was this February last year, January, February, when all those Chinese balloons were flying over the United States. So there was one that flew all the way down to the southern coast, or to the South Carolina coast. There was one that was shot down, I think, over Virginia. And then this one, or there happened to be another one that was shot down over Lake Huron. Well, the way the story goes is it was Super Bowl Sunday. I was cleaning my apartment, and like I said, I'm very well aware with how often these planes take off. And suddenly I heard some planes take off on a Sunday, and I'm like, okay, well those are the F-16s. I'm like, why are they taking off? It's a Sunday, they don't fly on Sundays. And pulled up air traffic control, and I heard them say, oh, I heard them say what sounded like practice scramble. If you're not familiar, here in Madison or at Truax Field, the 115th Fighter Wing is known as a NORAD ready site. Essentially, if they get an alert, the planes are up off the ground within 5 minutes carrying live ammunition if for some reason they need to shoot down a plane or protect a certain area. In fact, right now with the RNC going on over Milwaukee, the 115th F-35s are flying overhead for hours throughout the day in case something comes into what's known as that TFR, or Temporary Flight Restricted Area. In this case, like I said, I heard them say practice scramble. So I was like, okay, it's weird that they're practicing on a Sunday. All right, whatever. And I was cleaning that day, finished cleaning a couple of hours, and then I pull up my phone and I see, oh, balloon over Lake Huron. Huh. All right, well, those guys took off. There's a balloon over Lake Huron, and then I saw, you could see on radar that there were these other planes, other military planes flying around. I was like, you know what, let me just travel over to the airport real quick. And I live about 10 minutes away from the airport. And sure enough, the area where these guys were parked was open, and they were gone. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna wait. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited for about 2 or 3 hours, and it was getting close to sunset, and finally I hear the air traffic control say, oh, we're coming back. We're returning to base. And sure enough, took a picture of these planes, and I'll say that these are not 115th from the Wisconsin Air National Guard, but these are the 148th Fighter Wing, which is the Minnesota National Guard, that are currently based here for that mission or alert mission. Well, as I took these pictures, I was just standing out there and I decided to take these pictures, and one thing you'll notice is that, so these stripes have different meanings. The stripe, when it's brown, means that it's a live ammunition. And you can see that this one's empty. And that's because it did indeed fire a missile. Well, you may have heard that there were 2 missiles that were fired because the first one missed. And while I have no evidence of this, there's a very good possibility that because I posted these pictures that showed that 2 missiles were fired, the Secretary of Defense had to say that there were 2 missiles fired. Again, I have no evidence of that. He might have already had plans to be saying that, but there's a very real possibility that because of that because of those pictures, he had to admit that. And I actually got to meet the commander who was in charge that particular day for this alert ready mission. And I happened to talk to him, and I was like, "Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to reveal that you guys had fired 2 missiles." And he's like, "Oh, it's fine. I mean, you're in a public area, and it's no big deal. It was just a really weird day." And happened to be able to meet him, kind of in thanks to this picture, because his wife contacted me on Instagram and said, "Hey, my husband is doing his final flight on this particular day. Can you be out there to take pictures of him?" I was out there, got to meet him, and it was a really cool experience. So I like to use the Capitol for a lot of these sort of different shots. This was one of the final flights of the F-16s while the 115th Wisconsin Air National Guard had them. Every once in a while, so there's 2 big runway, or there's 1 big runway that Madison uses. And every once in a while, the winds are just a certain direction, and maybe that big runway is closed, and they have to take off in this direction, which allows us to get the Capitol in the building. And this picture was actually used by the 115th for some advertisement for a little bit, which was really, really exciting to be able to get that. So, as I mentioned, the 115th Fighter Wing now has the F-35s, which I'm sure here in Oregon, I've been told that you hear them very often as they're coming in for landing. I'll say, I won't touch on the subject of who's louder or not, but I'll say that in the many times that I've been watching them, these guys are louder to me, but that's a separate point. This happened to be another picture that I thought was going to get me in trouble. So these guys took off. This happened to be during a night training mission. And I was on Twitter, and I happened to follow some forecasters and some also people who nerd out on planes, some weather guys who were at a news station in Iowa at the time. I think it's Cedar Rapids, or no, Des Moines. Sorry, they've since moved on now, but they were there. And I saw I saw one of them say, "Oh, we just had some fighter jets fly overhead, like they're really low." And I said, "Huh." So I responded to him and I said, "Hey," I was like, "we had some planes take off here." And I was listening into, their, what is known as their clearance. Essentially, air traffic control says, okay, you're gonna take off to this direction, you're gonna go here, you're gonna go there. And in that, they said, we're gonna fly by Des Moines, or Cedar Rapids, whatever it was. And I said, let me check. So I sent him this picture. I said, hey, odds are it might have been this. I did hear them say that they were gonna fly by that area, but I didn't know that they were gonna fly low. And sure enough, they pulled up their air traffic control, they sent it to me, and I'm like, and they said, does any of this sound familiar? And sure enough, I hear the call sign that I had heard that day. They use either Badger or Bucky for their missions. And sure enough, it turns out that it was them, even though they were denying it at first. But then someone posted a video from outside the airport, and sure enough, it was them. So yeah, it's one of those situations where it's like you got to be really careful what you say. Thankfully, I've been able to build a relationship with the 115th and the Wisconsin Air National Guard, where occasionally I'll say, hey, you know what, this picture is really cool, but I know that there might be something off with it. Is it okay for you? Is it okay if I post it? I don't have to get that permission from them, but because I like to be a friend to them and be able to share pictures and have them not be mad at me, I'll do that here and there. Now, if you've ever been outside of Truax, you know that we also have Blackhawks here. So this is from the Army National Guard, the Wisconsin Army National Guard. This particular case, you see these 5 helicopters. This was also one of those situations where kind of just knowing people pays off. I was hanging out at a bar with a friend, and on a Friday night, I get a text from one of the pilots. I think it was the lead pilot, the guy up in the front. I get a text from him, and he's like, hey, can you be at the Wisconsin Dells Airport tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Sure. Okay, I'll be there. Drive up next morning. I stopped drinking so I will be able to get up early the next morning. Get up early the next morning, drive over there, and suddenly I see these 6 helicopters coming. Well, essentially what they were doing is they were practicing dropping loads and being able to, land in synchronization, because they were doing a performance at Oshkosh just a couple of weeks later. And actually that performance was amazing. It was super cool. They're actually planning on doing the same thing next week. So that'll be a lot of fun to see. But yeah, I've been able to thankfully get these Blackhawks as well. Like you heard me say, this was a slightly faster shutter speed, so you see a little bit of the blur from the back rotor. But not as much on the top, on the main rotor. Again, this is one of those situations where I was still trying to figure out, like, okay, what am I comfortable with actually, being able to get them and do stuff like that. You all probably saw this picture on the advertisement that the senior center had. This was actually from the 115th 35s arriving for the first time here in Madison. So they held this really big, cool ceremony. One of those situations where I was like, why wasn't I invited? If I sent so many pictures to them. But it's fine. I was stood outside in a random parking lot right by the airport, and happened to get this really cool picture that the 115th actually really liked, and thanked me, and still uses in some of their advertisements today, being able to get the F-35s with the Capitol building on the side. And there's another picture of the F-35s. I think this was also during their landing, or during their first landing. Just really cool, sleek jet. I'll say I prefer the F-16s. They're a lot more fun to photograph, just because these guys, they're loud enough without the afterburner, as I'm sure you're all aware. So they don't get to use their afterburner all that often. So we don't get to hear that all that often. Which it's really cool to photograph, but we also get that, why they can't do it. We don't want to piss off the neighbors. Same thing, I was able to get this really cool head-on shot. So the F-35 is built for stealth. when it's got these missile racks, and if it were to carry missiles on the outside, it wouldn't be as stealthy, because that is giving off a radar signal. But in itself is a very stealthy plane. Very expensive, as I'm sure you've all heard, just because of how advanced it is. What's cool about these planes is these started being designed back in the early late 90s, and finally being able to become in production the last couple of years, and being able to go out on deployment. Another one of those F-35s. This was a really cool, this one was particularly fun. Every once in a while they'll do those night missions, like I said. They don't use the afterburner with the F-35, so you don't get as much of the cool plane out the back, but it's cool to get them with that silhouette. This particular day, it happened to be one of those days where it had just rained earlier in the day, and we had a really crazy sunset that with all these really beautiful colors. So it was just always looking for, how can you make things different? How can I make this particular picture different, or how can I mess around with it to get something different? The F-35 also, or the Wisconsin Air National Guard, flies around every 4th of July to do flyovers around the country, around the state. Most recently, actually this was last year, but this was taken over Wanakee. I ran into someone who was basically, they're always talking to a pilot whenever they do these flyovers. They're saying, okay, time on target is this time, they're going to start the national anthem at this time, so on and so forth. Ran into one of the guys and I said, hey, do you know exactly where they're going to fly? And he said, kind of this direction. I'm like, okay, well, it helps me, but kind of not really. And I knew I wanted the flags in the picture. And sure enough, I got lucky. I was at the right spot at the right time, right as they were flying over, and I was able to get the Wisconsin flag and the United States flag blowing while they were flying across. This is one of the pictures that they also really enjoy. A couple weeks later at Oshkosh, I saw it on their merchandise table, and I was like, hey, are you guys selling my picture? And they're like, oh no, we just have it here to show it off. I'm like, okay, cool, all right, that's fine. As long as you're not selling it, I mean, you guys can use it for whatever you want, but if you're gonna sell it, then yeah. I'm gonna want to cut.
Yeah.
Oh, this one's a little cut off, unfortunately, but this is a picture that I took last year. So this was the first F-35 flyover for the Wisconsin Air National Guard over Lambeau Field. You can see the F-35s up here. It's a little cut off, but it was 4 of them. I got in contact with one of the pilots. The original goal of this picture was, I had originally planned to take this picture not last year, but in September 2022. They were going to do a flyover over Camp Randall with the F-16s for the 9/11 memorial or 9/11 tribute. They were going to do a flyover. I had gotten in contact. I had gotten an okay with air traffic control here in Madison. I had gotten an okay with the 115th, and I had been talking to them for a couple of weeks. And finally, all right, we coordinated. Up until half an hour before they were supposed to do the flyover, where I was on the phone with everyone. I was like, okay, so what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? Because it was so cloudy, I wasn't able to get off the ground, unfortunately. And in fact, even they had trouble doing their flyover, just because of how cloudy it is and having to be at a certain altitude away from the stadium. Well, in this case, got really lucky that the clouds were really high, thankfully. We were just circling in orbit, over the stadium. And finally I hear them say, okay, we're gonna come in. I had the time that they were supposed to be directly over the stadium. And the pilot that I had, who happens to be a friend who I had basically hired to take me overhead, I said, all right, let's fly right over it. He was a little nervous to fly directly over it, so we were a little bit off to the side, but it was cool, still cool to be able to get the F-35s and the flag and the stadium overhead. One of those situations, don't know how Teresa's in the back. Teresa's one of my best friend's mom, Wyatt. Wyatt is one of my best friends. He happened to be at the stadium, and I had sent him a video of while I was overhead. I didn't know he was there. And he texted me later on saying, oh, yeah, dude, there was this plane flying overhead, and I told my wife, oh, Jaime would be so jealous of that guy who's probably up there, and then sure enough, it ended up being me. So. And last couple of pictures, so this was most recently with the F-35s with their 4th of July flyover. This was as they were taking off from Madison. Again, every once in a while we'll get lucky where they have to take off a certain runway just because something else is closed, and being able to get the Capitol in the background. And it's always fun to be able to use the Capitol and to use other different, anything besides the sky or the cloudy sky as a background. So one of my personal favorites is the Capitol, being able to use that as some sort of background or something else to attract the eye. And yeah, so that's those are my pictures. I chose 45 pictures out of the 160,000 pictures that I have on my laptop. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'm happy to talk about them or talk about anything else if you'd like. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you so
Very
much.
good.
Thank you.
You grab there. Which one call it?
Because they
To
sound
get
you.
like they were just directly overhead.
Yeah.
I mean, everything just shook.
Yeah, yeah, no, they were definitely flying last night. In fact, I went to Milwaukee Monday because I knew that they were flying. So I was like, okay, I want to get a picture of them overhead. Looking through the sky, and it wasn't until yesterday, right before I came back, that I was finally able to get a picture of them. But yeah, all they do is they sit up there for hours and hours and hours, and after a couple of hours, someone else will come and relieve them. And last night, so yeah, they came back around 11 last night. So they did call. I think they might have come back around the same time on Monday as well. But yeah, that's fairly common for whenever there's big events. We are fortunate to have, that alert mission here. So if, knock on wood, we don't ever have to run into another situation where they're required, those guys are called and they'll take off. They weren't necessarily on alert, or they weren't at alert status on 9/11, but the next day these guys were, loading up bombs and missiles, I should say, and were flying over the Midwest and taking care just in case if there were any other terrorist attacks. The most recent time that I'm aware of where there was a one of those alert status or alert scrambles that was a real world is there was a pilot who took off out of Texas, and he took off out of Texas, started flying, went up to, I want to say about 28,000 feet. Normally when you're at 28,000 feet, you have to, if you're not in a pressurized cockpit, you have to have an oxygen mask. Well, what they think happened is he took off, he had some sort of medical issue, and the plane essentially kept climbing, and then it just started heading over here into Wisconsin. And over Wisconsin, suddenly, I was listening to air traffic control, suddenly I hear them scramble. They go off, and you can actually hear what they'll say is, unidentified aircraft, or they'll say the aircraft's registration number, which is usually an N number for at least here in the United States. They'll say N12345. This is the U.S. Air Force on guard, which is a certain frequency that all pilots have to monitor. On guard, off your wing. Please contact us, or you will be, they don't necessarily say you'll be fired upon, but that is the last resort. Is that they'll fire upon them if. And in that case, that pilot hadn't been talking to air traffic control all the way over Nebraska, I think, and his plane finally flew into Wisconsin airspace. Those jets were scrambled, and I guess they were keeping an eye on him. He wasn't talking to them, and eventually it did crash. What they think is that more than likely in that case, he had some kind of medical event and then had hypoxia. So essentially ran out of oxygen, and the plane just kind of went on autopilot until it crashed. But for the most part, whenever there are those scrambles, thankfully it doesn't end that way. Most of the time it's just someone who, got too comfortable and hasn't checked, is like, oh yeah, I've taken that route several times. Doesn't check, what are called notice to air missions, or NOTAMs. So they won't look at that, and they'll just miss that there was a TFR or some sort of restriction overhead. Thankfully, I haven't heard of one going on over the RNC yet, but I know it always happens whenever the president is around, or whenever the vice president is around. Not as often here in Wisconsin, because we don't have as much air traffic. but at least said, let's say whenever the president's in LA or San Francisco, there's always once or twice where that happens. Odds are is it probably will happen either today or tomorrow over the RNC because Oshkosh is next week. And all the pilots, there's thousands of planes that will be coming in. And most of the pilots are really good about checking those instructions that they get from the from EAA and from Oshkosh, saying this is the path that you have to take. And EAA has been saying, keep in mind the RNC is happening. There's a temporary flight restriction because normally those guys, what they'll do is if they're coming from the East Coast or somewhere up east of Milwaukee, they'll fly over Milwaukee as a waypoint before they start heading up to Oshkosh between Madison and Milwaukee. So I fully expect for there to be at least one or two of those kind of moments where they have to get them and say, hey, get out of here, or something like that. Generally they'll just say, all right, get out of here, or something like that. But if let's say for example they don't pay attention for a whole long time, or it just seems something weird about it, the F-35s or F-16s or whatever is on station at that point, what they'll do is they'll actually follow the pilot to make sure that they land, and then police or whoever's there is waiting on the ground for them. It's unfortunate it happens, but it's just one of those things of like when you're a pilot. I'm not a pilot, but if I was, it's one of those things that I'm like, oh my god, gotta make sure that doesn't happen. Even though it would be cool to see an F-16 or an F-35 off my wing, I don't want to get in trouble. So.